I want to first start off by thanking the Deloitte team for their very thorough report. Their team spent 5 months reviewing background documentation across planning, budgeting, policies, and procedures, meeting minutes and correspondence, and completing stakeholder interviews and site visits. Throughout this work, they provide us with a better understanding of how LDE ended up in such a dire financial situation that necessitated the MOU earlier this year. While our council and administration continue to review the report's findings, I can say this: we are alarmed and incredibly concerned with Deloitte's findings of what appears to be significant level of mismanagement. The report states that council was lacking information from LDE throughout the planning and construction process, preventing fully informed decision-making and sound oversight of the project. Further, the report identified instances where the information that was provided was contradictory or inconsistent. This is extremely, and I'll say extremely concerning, given this was primarily a taxpayer-funded project. We expect, and I think the public experts, that organizations who receive public funds exercise high standards in managing those funds. Well, I'll invite the city manager, Lloyd Brierley, up to speak shortly to provide greater detail about what the report uncovered. I do want to make one thing clear. The situation we've been placed in as a city is inexcusable and frustrating. I share this feeling with our community, not only as mayor, but also as a long-standing resident of Lethbridge. Now, with the summary report in hand, our council is ready to continue the critical work ahead. This will mean establishing safeguards throughout new policies and procedures that enhance existing due diligence practices. This will ensure accountability from all organizations receiving city funds, particularly in strategic planning and financial reporting. The findings have identified several leadership, financial, and operational shortfalls that will need to be considered. This includes the significant underestimation of the demolition costs of the old buildings, the parking lot improvements that were not completed, as well as the inability of the facility to accommodate livestock. In the report, Deloitte assessed the current state of the Lethbridge and District exhibition and proposed options for a future operating model that will be reviewed in greater detail over the coming months. Since we installed new leadership at Lethbridge and District exhibition, we've already seen significantly improved operations and financial efficiencies implemented at the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Center. It's important to note that it was city administration that drew council's attention to the significant financial predicament. I want to take this opportunity to thank our administration for the work and my council colleagues for their proactive approach in investigating this situation for and on behalf of our community. We now have this amazing facility in our community, and it is a beautiful facility. And this report is the next step in setting a successful course into the future. I have the utmost confidence in our city administration's ability to implement the report's recommendations. And with that, I'll turn the time over to our city manager, Mr. Brierley, to discuss some of the specifics around the report.
Deloitte's report details a serious level of mismanagement of the more than $70 million in public funding provided to LDE by the province of Alberta, the city of Lethbridge, Lethbridge County, and the federal government. While Deloitte's summary report will be shared on the city website, I want to highlight some of the most pressing issues discovered. It is now clear that the information shared with council at the early stages of project planning and decision making was incomplete. Between 2019 and 2020, LDE was asked to present to council multiple times to share information and answer questions about the requested funding. As this predates our current executive team, city administration went back and reviewed the meeting materials and transcripts in detail for this period. In my opinion, the City Council of the day asked many questions of LDE. However, this Deloitte report tells us The presentations made by past LDE management were missing critical context and was subject to limitations. These presentations are what council used for their decision-making in funding the project. The issues continued throughout the entirety of the project, preventing council from receiving accurate updates. For example, LDE did not communicate a $27 million increase in the total expected project cost until financial difficulties required emergency funding, despite the significant impact this would have on the city and its taxpayers. Oops, duplicate page. Deloitte reviewed the procurement process for key resources supporting the project, including the project manager, architect, and construction manager. This review revealed a lack of formal procurement processes surrounding the architect and project manager, which were procured through sole source contracts dating back to as early as 2013. Other procurement processes had undisclosed changes to the evaluation criteria that potentially disadvantaged higher ranking proponents. This lack of consistency created the possibility for a conflict of interest in procurement decisions that prevented effective and appropriate project management. Despite procurement processes not following common practice, Deloitte observed no inappropriate behavior on the part of the selected construction contract vendor. This review also indicated a lack of adherence to the principles fundamental to sound project management. A clear miss was that in the project was the absence of documentation as simple as a project charter. A charter is intended to act as a North Star for a project, outlining the basic elements such as scope, budget, deliverables, and timeline. The absence of this document may have contributed to a lack of clarity regarding project objectives and scope. Regrettably, this review also identified the improper use of funds by LDE leadership. Deloitte conducted a review of the historical CEO expenses from 2020 to 2023, inspecting a total of 47 CEO and board expenses to ensure that they had been incurred for a valid business purpose and were in compliance with LDE policies. 100% of the CEO expenses and 50% of the board expenses tested were not in compliance with LDE policy. Expenses filed by both the CEO and board members indicated that money was spent on items such as gifts, luxury hotels, event tickets, alcohol at private functions, car washes, televisions, and other various forms of entertainment. Without itemized receipts, it's difficult to determine if these expenses were incurred for a valid business purpose. Items purchased for the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Center were sometimes lavish, including over $331,000 on custom-made reclaimed furniture and fixtures. While the issues I've highlighted here only provide a brief overview of Deloitte's findings, their summary report spans assessments of strategy and planning, project execution, governance, use of funds, and communication by LDE throughout this project. It also captured a review of the Agri-Food Hub and Trade Center's future operations, as little, if any, planning appears to have been done for this. The city will continue to work through this over the coming months. I commend the current LDE team for their efforts to reduce the deficit and implement many organizational, financial, and operational improvements. Since the changes in LDE governance this year, the operating deficit has already been reduced by more than $2.4 million. And efforts continue to identify efficiencies while increasing revenue. I echo Mayor Higgins' confidence in the current LDE team and our city administration's ability to get this facility on track. As mentioned, more information about this summary report will be available on the City of Lethbridge website. Before I open to questions, I want to reiterate the remarks made by Mayor Hagan. Our residents expect the city to be responsible stewards of taxpayers' dollars. I think they would expect the same of any organization that has received taxpayer funding. This report is the first step in ensuring this happens going forward, as many of you heard today. We regret the situation we are faced with, but can guarantee that we will work over the next several months to install guardrails, policies, and systems to prevent it from happening again. It's also important to note that this work is still ongoing. As you've heard, the summary report has been turned over to the Economic Crimes Unit of the Lethbridge Police Service for further investigation. And city administration may also initiate deeper examinations of the findings. I'll now be happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Wait, right at the beginning, you mentioned there was a $27 million cost with overrun, or
Yeah, so at the time, it's a great question, Al. At the time, it was $27 million. That cost has now increased to up to $32 million. So you'll hear more about this tomorrow. We will talk more about that's additional capital cost to complete the project, as was originally stated. There's additional operating costs, and I don't want to steal tomorrow's thunder, so we'll talk about that a bit more tomorrow.
Can you talk about some of the recommendations that were made in the Del-Witt report as far as like operations and like the governance of exhibition?
Certainly. So the governance, as you've heard today through my speaking notes and the discussions at committee, there were a number of things in terms of guardrails, policies, procedures, structures, and information used for decision making that was clearly absent or missing that may have led to decisions that were not as effective as they could have been.
If the city were to move forward with the event kind of strategy of having the city take over finding those community events and LP focus on agriculture, would that be a benefit in general when it comes to, bringing that property and say the visit Lethbridge.com and kind of working function together?
So then again, another great question. Keep in mind that this report is very fresh. In fact, we just received the final version last night. There's certainly things that need to be explored, but as you heard today from Deloitte, when we talk about the Ag Society, so there's 290 some Ag Societies in the province, and when you talk about the ones like Lethbridge that have significant degree of complexity that require a different specialization in terms of accountants, engineering, and so forth, that complexity lends itself to looking at different models as compared to a smaller Ag Society that may not have those same considerations.
What were your feelings when you first saw this full report?
Oh, I think my feelings are probably consistent with many of the public. This is not okay. This is unacceptable, and we expected better, and we need to see better going forward, and that's where the changes in terms of the structure, policies, and decision-making criteria going forward need to come into play.
And something that was mentioned was that even where there were policies in place with the board's expenses, that kind of thing, they weren't necessarily followed. So I guess looking ahead, you mentioned some of those guardrails, but what are the things that can be put in place that aren't just policies that could be done to change this? Because those existed in some form.
Yeah, to touch on that, so there are policies, so it's incumbent on the board, just like council is my board, to hold their leadership accountable, and then the board itself would have an audit committee. For instance, the audit committee would review select facets and based on risk and value to determine that. So if those structures are in place, it's proven across the country and across the world that they work well. So there are some improvements that need to be made.
Does this change anything moving forward with the city with regards to working with any other groups in the city?
Great question. So I think as you've heard, when we talk about policies and procedures and organizations receiving funding from the city, it's incumbent on us to look at all of those to say, do we have the appropriate mechanisms in place to ensure that the city is receiving value for money?
You talked about the next steps over the next few months, but for those who are maybe in the public wondering what those are, can you give a better explanation and maybe a little bit of a timeline if there is one?
Timeline, off the top of my head, as I mentioned, this is very fresh. So I think what we need to do, so tonight, before tomorrow's presentation, some of my executive team and I will be meeting. We'll be looking at what we're discussing tomorrow. And there are considerations. Council has some really hard decisions here, because at the end of the day, when we talk about capital costs and operating costs, the decision before council tomorrow is, again, back to keeping the facility going, closing the facility, what that looks like, and what the costs of keeping that facility going are. Those are the primary or initial decisions that need to be made. And then depending on those decisions, we need to look at, okay, so what do we do from here? What else might we need to look at in terms of LDE-related work or decisions, and what areas do we need to drill into more? There's a lot of analysis to arrive at those decisions, and that is weeks, if not months of work to arrive at that. And then happy to talk about timelines after that.
So tomorrow's meeting, that's gonna be about what council's decisions have to be about on the exhibition moving forward, I guess.
Yeah, so our CFO and treasurer will do most of that presentation tomorrow, and it will restate some of what you've heard today and the considerations for council going forward, as well as the cost implications that are associated with that and how that might affect your average taxpayer.
It's been mentioned, and I know you probably can't comment too much on it, but the report has been forwarded to the LPS Economic Crimes Unit. Is that standard procedure for a report like this?
Well, I wouldn't say it's standard procedure. No, there were things within the report that warranted that level, and for questions beyond that, you would need to direct them to the Economic Crimes Unit.
When was this handled? Like, this one just today?
So this report has been handed. There's been some conversations that we've had leading up to this, so it wasn't just out of the blue that are we at the threshold, and I can't comment further.